Hi YouTube, you are here with another A16Z hallway conversation, and this morning I'm here with Li Jin again, and also Darcy Coolican, and we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is education. And I hit a milestone in my own personal life, which is I took my oldest son and I bundled him off to UC Santa Cruz, where he's starting his 4-year education as an undergrad, go banana slugs. And so it got us thinking about how long before that's not the normal thing to do. We're seeing so many different ways to get educated. We're seeing alternatives to colleges. And so I thought we'd have a fun conversation about the future of education. So why don't we start with the big question, what is education?
Right, so I actually think that's one of the core questions as we think about kind of technology and innovation and education, is actually defining education itself. I think historically, it's been this big bundle. It's been, I am learning skills that are, some are kind of core fundamental skills like numeracy and literacy. Some are, more fungible skills like how to learn, critical reasoning. Some are like domain-specific skills like coding and accounting. But that's kind of like one piece of the bundle. Mm-hmm. Then you've had signaling. So, I go to school to get a degree, and then that degree signals to employers that I'm intelligent and conscientious and have a strong work ethic, and that's like a second part of the bundle. Mm-hmm. It's everything, to a professional network. I go to school to meet people. I didn't learn anything in school, but the relationship I developed were really the valuable part. You hear that a lot. You can even think about it as like socialization for younger children. You can think about it as like international students. Education is like a pathway into a country. So you've got this really big, broad bundle. And traditionally, education in the kind of analog world has been that. It's been everything bundled into one. Every person that had a part of that value proposition that was really compelling to them had to take the whole bundle. And now you're seeing this trend where it's kind of unbundling. And you're seeing companies that are going after one part of that education stack, whether it's, specific skills and kind of, a code boot camp teaching you just some of those domain-specific skills, whether it's some of these, systems that let you test for aptitude and test for certain skill sets, and that's kind of a signaling method to employers. But I think you're seeing kind of this trend around the broader definition of education is really changing.
Yeah, and I think that's resulting from a lot of the consumer demands and needs that have arisen in the past few decades. So it used to be the case that higher education was not so closely coupled with the idea of job training and being equipped with professional skills such that you could actually be employable and get a high-paying job. I think that's a new thing that sort of emerged in the last few decades, and especially after the recession, is students are now more and more thinking of education as a way for me to get a job. Mm-hmm. I think UCLA ran a survey a few years ago surveying their students as to what is the purpose of college for you? And 80% of them said to get a job. Mm-hmm. And I think that same question was posed to university presidents by Pew Research, and I think only 50% of them said that the main purpose was to get a job.
Yeah. And you're seeing drops in the percentage of undergraduates who choose sort of liberal arts or sort of the well-rounded majors, right? Sort of the Englishes and the histories, right? So as a percentage of total, of the total undergraduate class, that's been declining, right? Because it's sort of like, gee, I better get a job, and then maybe I'll do like my fancy, well-rounded things elsewhere.
Right. It's becoming much more ROI oriented, as opposed to this sort of airy place where you go to become self-actualized.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So as we think about sort of the 4-year college or undergraduate experience, how is that changing? What startups are you seeing that are here to replace the university?
Well, I think one part of that question is kind of which parts of that bundle are they pulling across. So I think that's one part of it, is that people are seeing that trend towards more kind of ROI-driven education, and they're focusing much more on, what can we give you that's ROI-driven? So can we teach you to code? Can we teach you marketing? Can we teach you some of these hard domain-specific skills that are very kind of ROI positive and less away from that kind of 4-year degree? I think another trend that you're kind of seeing in terms of what's happening in education is that the vision of what education is broadening. That it used to be, you started as a 4-year-old and you went to elementary school, and some went to secondary, and some went to college, and some went to vocational schools. and you kind of had this, learning period of your life, and then you had a like application period of your life.
I'm working.
Yeah.
I'm done learning.
Now I'm done. Exactly. And so I think, another trend that you're seeing, and I think this is a lot of kind of boot camps and Code Academy and Lambda School and things like that. You're seeing a trend towards on the later end around lifelong learning and kind of training and skills development. And I think on the earlier end, you're seeing kind of before school, you're seeing a lot more innovation there. So you're seeing things like Wonder School with Chris Bennett, who's kind of, developing a different model for what kind of preschool or early childhood care could look like. And I think you're seeing a lot of innovation on that end of the spectrum as well.
Sort of around traditional schooling, right? Yeah. Sort of just the before you get to school, and then after you get out of school, there's continuous learning with companies like Udacity. So we see a lot in that space. What about the ones that are going after, right, the super aggressive, I'm just going after a college. You never need to go to college because you're going to come, so talk to me about some of these companies.
Yeah. So I think what I've seen in this space is that companies are going after, basically looking at like all of the professions in the US and comparing how many people are actually trained and qualified for those roles today versus what is the actual need in those professional areas. And one of the clear examples or verticals to go after is computer science education. There's a huge shortage of software engineers in the US. And so a lot of startups are going after this space and trying to train software engineers to become workers in that industry. So we're seeing both models that are trying to deliver this kind of education both online, such as Lambda School. You have companies like Launch School, Thinkful, Block, also doing pure online coding education. And then there's also companies that are sort of pushing forward what offline education can look like for just software engineering. So in our portfolio, we are investors in Make School, which actually has a physical campus in San Francisco. But rather than being a 4-year-long sort of bundle of every subject, liberal arts plus software engineering, it's just pure software engineering education for 2 years. There's 42, which is a French company that has campuses in both Paris and I think Fremont. And then there's also all of the offline coding boot camps, which have physical presences, and students actually move to that city, spend a few months learning very deeply how to code, and then graduating and getting a job.
And in general, these schools are a lot shorter than a traditional 4-year undergrad program, right? Like how long do these last?
Yeah, I would say anywhere from a few months to a couple of years. I think what we've really seen influence the structure of these programs has been the changing business model. So in the past few years, the nature that these programs are monetizing has really shifted from upfront tuition payment, which has been the traditional higher ed business model, to now more and more programs are offering income share agreements or ISAs. And under an income share agreement, you don't have to pay upfront. It's when you graduate and get a job, you then pay a share of your income back to the program for a fixed period of time. So if you get a high-paying job as expected and you pay a share of your income for, let's say, a couple of years, that can actually be a pretty high lifetime value for that particular student. And the result of that business model is that the programs themselves then are changing to sort of drive that positive outcome for everyone. So the programs are getting shorter because they're incentivized to get that payback sooner. They're incentivized to actually teach these students something so that they can be employable in the job market. They're incentivized to be super focused and structured such that there's no frivolous education, that it's really oriented towards getting a job and being professionally successful.
And I think one just thing to think about is, as we're talking about kind of like going after the education stack, I think the kind of first wave of companies really went after that kind of like skills value proposition.
Like data science, JavaScript.
Hard
right,
kind of
hard
skills.
STEM things.
Exactly, with kind of like domain specific application, very much focused on that like high ROI, because quite frankly, maybe that's where the value, that's where the arbitrage opportunity was between what was getting offered and what students actually wanted. I think, if we think about that kind of bundle that's happening as well, you've got this other part to it, which is the kind of networking piece. And you've seen other companies and other projects kind of evolve there. You're seeing things like, YC, which is incredibly valuable as a networking place. And people talk about YC as kind of like startup graduate school, right? And you're seeing places like that have added an incredible amount of value, providing that kind of networking, professional development, value proposition that was traditionally the domain of higher education. Yeah. You're also seeing that in like co-working spaces like the Wing. You're seeing, you're seeing it in a million different iterations and different types of form factor. But that value proposition that was once higher education is now being translated into other types of new, interesting companies.
Right. So sort of network development, like who are my peeps?
Right.
Right. Can actually be not a function of your school,
right,
but a function of I found them on LinkedIn.
Right.
I met them at the Wing.
Right.
I went through the same cohort in YC, and
so
there's all of these other places where you can sort of bond.
I found a meetup. Right, and it's way more granular, and it's way less of a one-size-fits-all than kind of it was in traditional education. Right. I think the hardest one is that brand signaling piece. I think that will be the last domino to fall, just because I think there's a ton of strength in kind of traditional education around that signaling piece. But I think as we look at innovation, you're seeing kind of the stack slowly get crept into from the outside.
So you would argue, look, the last universities or sort of schools to get threatened would be the sort of high brand, the Harvards, the Stanfords, the Waterloos, that type of school. What about schools that aren't as prominent as that? What happens to the tier 2, tier 3 universities?
Yeah, so we've thought a lot about this question through the lens of disruptive innovation. So Clayton Christensen has coined the term disruptive innovation. And he made the really bold prediction about 10 years ago that half of all colleges in the US would be bankrupt by now. And that hasn't quite happened, although that trend is starting, and we've seen some school closures at the higher level. So we often think about, like, is higher ed even disruptable? And what would that look like? I think brand is a huge piece of what's protecting traditional institutions from being disrupted. And I think brand is very closely coupled with exclusivity. So at the lower levels where the brand is less strong, I think that is a prime target for disruption along that angle. I think another piece of what keeps higher ed very defensible is the network effects of the actual alumni networks. For instance, the Harvard Alumni Network is super valuable. It's something that a ton of people want to tap into. These are people who graduate and go on to become the CEOs or the hiring managers at all of the companies that people want to work at. So it's very difficult for a new entrant to have that kind of powerful network from the get-go. So that's another piece of what really maintains the defensibility for traditional higher ed.
I think, and I don't know if this is always true, but I think probably you will see the innovation come from the bottom up, and you will see the innovation come where right now the alternative is like non-consumption, right? So it won't necessarily be the person going to Harvard or Stanford or Waterloo or one of those schools. And at the start, it might not even be the person going to a kind of tier 2, tier 3 or vocational school or something like that. It'll be the person who's literally not getting an education right now. And that may mean that it starts out international and then moves domestic. There may be different ways that plays out, but I think probably you will see a lot of the innovation come in places where right now people are just not getting anything or not doing anything, and that's where they'll start to consume, they'll start to gain value from it, and then you'll slowly see it creep up the stack.
And you had brought up international, which I want to sort of dig into, which is there's sort of broad trends, right? So let me sort of tee up the international question this way, which is traditionally the United States and Canada has been among the most prestigious higher education opportunities, right? The product is the best, right? Here we're starting to see immigration headwinds, we're starting to see this sort of decline of the tier 2 and tier 3 schools. So how long does this last where sort of the big motion you see in the world is somebody growing up in India or China or the Philippines or Mexico wanting to come to a US or Canadian university? Does that last forever? Are we beginning to see the beginnings of the end of that?
So that's a great question. I actually think what what that turns on is what is the value proposition of that student coming here, right? So I think historically for a lot of people, the value of coming to school in Canada or the United States was it was a pathway into a job market, into a country where, there was more opportunity. I think, whatever happens in kind of international politics and, all that will then play a role there, and that could lead to a decrease. But I think secondarily, it was the product, right? It was, the United States has either the best skills development or the United States and Canada have the best kind of brand. And so whether you were staying or whether you were returning, that product was seen as more valuable. I think, as we're talking about, I think the skills part will probably start to fall off as it becomes easier and easier to kind of develop these skills elsewhere. The brand thing will probably be more longer lasting, but again, I think there's probably a time limit on that as well.
I think another really interesting use case that might be a window into the future is to look at what's happening in MBAs and business schools. So I think for the past 4 years, there's been a precipitous decline in the number
of applications is shrinking.
Exactly. The number of applications is shrinking across the board, and the institutions that historically were thought of as immune to this, so Harvard, Stanford GSB, Wharton, the top business schools, they're now experiencing this too, where they're seeing year-over-year declines in the number of applications. And I think that goes back to what we mentioned about education being unbundled. There's now other options for that kind of professional networking. There's other options to learn accounting, finance, marketing, and all of the things that business school taught you. And the ROI is just not clear anymore, and students are becoming increasingly ROI oriented.
Yeah, the tuition on the top schools is still quite high, right? And so if you actually just do the math of, I'm paying $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 a year for 2 years, right? It's got to be a pretty big salary boost on the other side to make that make sense, as opposed to I'm getting the Udacity nano degree in marketing, and that lasts 3 months. And after the nano degree, look, this won't be the last nano degree I get. This will be one, and then I go back and, I've turbo boosted my career a little. I'm going to go back and get another, right? And that feels like it's going to be much more common in the future, which is it's not like, oh, I'm done with education. It's sort of an ongoing thing.
And I think it's to one of the points that Lee was making before is the business models are evolving to reflect that, right? The kind of what people need from the education system brought more broadly is changing. And you're seeing business models that reflect that. So whether it's the income share agreements, whether it's more kind of apprenticeship programs, there's different ways that people are building really interesting business models around this kind of evolving value proposition that was traditionally just education.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about sort of the career development, right? The things right before you go launch your career or you turbocharge your career. Let's go to the other end. What are you seeing at the very early education? Maybe talk a little bit about Wonder School.
Yeah. So Wonder School is a portfolio company that lets people set up preschools in their home. And I think what you're seeing there is it was this really underserved part of the market. Both daycare / preschool teachers were undercompensated. There was not enough schools. The schools that were there were too expensive. And so it was basically trying to think about how can you build a business model that lets preschool education, which we know is super important for the long-term development of children, how can you build a business model that makes that more practical? And I think that's what Chris and Wonder School have really done. They've taken the kind of real estate line item and softened that because it is in-home. They've made it so that it's closer to the children and the families that they're actually serving because it is in-home. So they've kind of restructured the business model around this kind of Airbnb-esque model, which has allowed a lot more inventory to come online, a lot more Wonder Schools to be opened up, and that's driving innovation in kind of preschool. The other thing that's interesting there is every Wonder School is slightly different, right? So the Wonder School that exists in the Mission in San Francisco can be very different from the Wonder School that exists in LA, that can be very different from the Wonder School that exists in, Fort Greene in Brooklyn. And so, you have a lot of more, a much more granular value proposition to parents around this idea of what they need in early childhood education.
Yeah. I remember talking with you about this idea when you'd sort of first met them before we had invested in our one of sort of walking one-on-one loops around the campus here, and I was so excited about this idea because there's so many places where you have a teacher who just loves teaching and she loves kids or he loves kids, but everything else about running a preschool is hard, which is the marketing, the finding the kids, the what systems do I use to check them in and check them out? How do I take payments, right? And so one of the things that's exciting about Wonder School is they take care of all of the business part. Right, of Wondering School, and they let these people who are fantastic with kids focus on what they're great at.
Yeah, it's really figuring out how you kind of empower them to run that small business, and that's really what they're doing, and that's letting a bunch more inventory come on the market because they don't need to worry about can I find a job at one of the 15 franchised preschools in this city? Can I find a job at a school that's run by the local government that maybe is not really growing at this point and there's not enough budget there? So I think that's the exciting thing about what they're doing on that end of the spectrum.
Yeah. I love these sort of businesses that are the, I think Mark Andreessen is the one who calls these sort of push button, make money type businesses, right? Lyft and Airbnb are classic examples of that, but Wonder School also, right? Which is like, if you have some magical skill, like you're great with kids, then there's a button that you can push that sort of turns that magical skill into income.
I mean, there's another interesting company called OutSchool as well that is kind of more focused on the at-home learning, like the homeschooling part of the demographic. And again, they're doing really interesting things about how they're kind of facilitating online education for that early childhood piece and creating much more kind of granular, personalized experiences, basically, that you could never have in an analog world in that part of the spectrum.
Yeah, what I love about that one is that they're really delocalizing instruction. So it used to be the case that you were basically, if you were a student, you were constrained to whatever teachers were available in your geographic area. That's all you had access to. But with OutSchool, they're matching teachers to students in different geographies. So if a teacher is located on the East Coast, but the student is here, and they're a really great match in terms of how that student learns and what they're interested in, they can really bridge that geography and still get paired together.
Tell me more. What are kids learning in OutSchool where you could actually be learning it from somebody far away?
Yeah, so I think there's just really interesting subjects on OutSchool and classes that are sort of new spins on existing traditional subjects. So I think there's like learning math through rockets or things like that. Like there's even art classes on OutSchool where you learn art by coloring in a book or by, like, for instance, taking a character that you love, like maybe SpongeBob SquarePants, and learning how to do art that way.
I think it's like maybe I learned statistics better through the analogy of baseball, and somebody else learns statistics better through the analogy of chess. And you can each find the course that most resonates with you to learn what is just a kind of very standard skill set.
Yeah, this has been one of the holy grails of education, which is you sort of understand what makes an individual student tick. What are they really interested in? Are they a visual learner or are they a muscle memory learner, right? And you can sort of combine these things, right? Which is we can turn algebra into sort of a muscle memory thing.
And instead of taking the top-down approach of they decide what the class should be and what the curriculum is, it's instead of a bottoms-up motion where they actually collect the requests from parents and from students and send that along to the teachers who have signed up for the platform and say, here's the list of classes that have been most requested by students. Can you teach them? Which I think is cool.
It's like a feedback loop on education that wasn't necessarily always there. I think one of the interesting things about this kind of more broadly as we think about kind of the way that education could potentially evolve is this idea that this is what the internet is great at, is taking what feels like a very niche community, taking it from around the world and making it big enough so that it's actually big enough to build a business around, right? So it's, I want a certain part of this bundle that used to be called education, and I want it delivered in a certain way, and I want it financed in a certain way. I want it at this time of my life, and if I'm just a kid in Canada growing up, like there may not be enough people for a critical mass of that to be delivered to me, but because we're on the internet, that works.
you can imagine that sort of like if this got to scale, you could basically design your own elementary, middle, high school experiences, right? Around, gee, I want to learn chemistry, but I want to learn it in the way that's sort of most interesting to me. Yeah. So you could imagine that one of the last things to get sort of unbundled, sort of core education like that could be unbundled. Through a model like this.
I mean, I think the most interesting businesses are the ones that are going to find, what are the big populations and how do they stack up on a few of these key dimensions and build the products that kind of link all those ones together. I mean, I think Lambda School is one that seems to be doing great on that. And, it's taking the ISA, the code, the skills, and then lining them up with a job at the end. And it's, found this really great niche in a market by delivering a very specific pieces of that value proposition in very specific ways that's resonating with a huge number of people.
Yeah. How do you think accreditation will work, right? So if you think one of the functions of a school is they're accredited by an agency, and all of the things downstream of that school basically recognize the awesomeness of that certification, right? So if you're a university and you want to say, like, what high school students do I offer admission to, you look for accreditation. If you're a hiring manager, you look for, like, what are the universities that I trust, right? And are they accredited, right? So there's sort of a downstream consumer. So if we go to this sort of radical model where you're building your own elementary education, you're building your own middle school education, you're building your own high school, what happens to accreditation?
Yeah, I think accreditation is one of the factors that really serves as a protective layer on top of the existing education system.
It's definitely a moat.
Exactly. And I think in a world quantitative metrics about the students' performance and their competency, accreditation served as a really great signal of, like, this person went through a program that actually met these requirements and is held to a certain standard bar. But I think with the internet and now with all of these programs and, like, the availability of reviews and the availability of, like, various assessments and other measurements of a student's competency and mastery of a subject, I think the era of accreditation is now going to start eroding, where it's going to matter less and less from a signaling perspective as a signal of quality. So I think in the higher ed space, accreditation used to be really important for an employer who is hiring someone. But now you can imagine with programs like Lambda School and other online or offline programs that are unaccredited that are still producing really great graduates, that becomes less important as a signal.
Yeah, you already see this at our startups that are looking for software engineers and designers and that type of thing. And the school has become less important than, well, show me your GitHub repos, or show me your portfolio on Dribbble, or show me sort of the body of work, right? What have you published? Where's your blog, right? Shoot me your last 6 podcasts, right? And I'll listen to them, as opposed to what university did you go to.
So I think the signaling is really important, and I think accreditation is one piece of that. But I do think the other thing that the platforms that will succeed will need to do is be very cognizant of that trust and safety and reputation. And I think that will be the ones that win and the ones that do great are going to be the ones that have that kind of, those feedback loops built into the product, right? Where it's, I can go to a Lambda school and I can know that I'm getting somebody that's qualified, right? And that's somehow built into the product, whether it's with testing, whether it's with feedback, whatever it is. Like, I think those are that piece of it is going to need to be really well thought out by the founders and the entrepreneurs that are going after that space.
Yeah, so the Udacity nano degree is still a thing, right? Because implied in the nano degree is a certain level of skill mastery.
Right.
The other important piece of accreditation is that right now, only accredited schools are eligible, those students are eligible for federal aid in terms of scholarships and loans. And that's a huge important aspect of why students choose to go to accredited schools.
Right.
So I think in the future, entrepreneurs will have to think about what are the evolutions in the business model such that their programs are still accessible to the students who would have otherwise gotten those loans.
Right. As a parent who's just going through this, where can I spend my 529 program money, right? Like, the accreditation is still the gateway to okay, you can use your federally set aside tax dollars to spend on tuition for these schools, but not these schools, right? And so
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons both the business models will evolve, is because they will have to evolve, because regulation moves really, really slowly. I think it's also one of the reasons that I personally believe that the kind of innovation will happen from the outside in. It will happen kind of outside the U.S. first, where these kind of regulatory moats are not as strong. Potentially with U.S. institutions and U.S. companies, but you won't need to have somebody saying, well, I can have my 529 money here that I can go to this school, or I can not use it to go to this school. That just won't enter into the calculus of how people think about it.
Yeah. All right, well, we thought we'd finish this segment up with a lightning round, which is I'm just going to tee up a set of topics and have Lee and Darcy react to them. So first up, coding boot camps.
I think they're a really great option for consumers and for students. They're a more targeted option for education, oftentimes lower cost than going to a traditional institution. As investors, though, I think we've seen challenges in terms of defensibility of the model, where someone else can possibly replicate the curriculum and the entire experience. And so it's not clear. To date, there haven't been large outcomes in this space, so we're keeping tabs on it, but wondering if there can be a large exit or a large outcome here.
I think they're great for the consumer. I think the challenges around building a coding bootcamp are kind of the same as the challenges of building any type of business. Thinking about customer acquisition costs, thinking about what your funnel looks like, thinking about the LTV of the customer and kind of the value proposition to the customer. And I think the best ones will be really successful. But I think there will probably be a lot that never figure out how to make that model work.
Great. All right, topic number 2, income share agreements.
I love them. So personally, I think they're great. I mean, personally, I think they, they allow innovation in education because you're now not bound by this kind of existing financing model that kind of created a whole bunch of distorted outcomes and distorted incentives. I think incentives are properly aligned between the financier and the school and the student. I just think overall, I think they make an enormous amount of sense, and I think we're going to see more and more of them as we go forward.
So I think they have pros and cons. I think they're not all pro, as a lot of the entrepreneurs or the financing companies would have us believe. I think sometimes they can actually pit the incentives of the student against the institution that's actually educating them. So an example of this is when I spoke to Adam Braun, the CEO of Mission U, which was like a combo of online and offline data analytics program. He told me that because they had a lot of holistic education around helping students think about what they actually wanted out of their lives and what they wanted to do professionally, a lot of those students actually realized that they didn't want to go into data analytics, or perhaps didn't want to take the highest paying job. They wanted to take the job where it was a company whose mission that they were really aligned with. And in those instances, obviously the institution has the incentive to want the student to take the highest paying job with a highest paying employer, whereas the student doesn't want the same thing. So I think ISAs, it's great if everyone is on board with the shared aim of maximizing profit and maximizing the financial outcome. But for a lot of students, I don't think they view education that way. And I think in those circumstances, students need options. Maybe income share is great for some students, maybe upfront payment makes sense for others. So I think it's nuanced.
So I think that's awesome, because I think that actually demonstrates the point of how education has become this bundle. It's like, is education about figuring out what we want to do with our lives, or is education about, teaching us a set of data analytics skills? And I think even now, you're seeing that tension kind of play out in schools like that, and I think that is part of what I think the future will help us figure out, is like what should be in education and what shouldn't be in education, as we have to define it more broadly, or what pieces should and should not. And then that will help us figure out, like, how should we finance this? So maybe a school that has both, what do I want to do with my life, and here's some skills, will need a different financing model from a kind of pure boot camp where it's just really about skills to get a job.
Yeah. People always joke about majors like underwater basket weaving as being like completely useless, but I'm a huge defendant of
totally.
liberal arts education and things that perhaps aren't as practically useful.
Right.
but I think they are somewhat luxury goods. Like, they're very expensive products that some people want to pay a premium for, and maybe they're not completely useful, but like there's consumers who are willing to pay for them.
Totally agree.
Perfect segue to the next topic. What is the most interesting business model you've seen outside of the income share agreement?
So I think something that I've found super interesting is you've seen some of the intersection of business models like gaming and how they've kind of intersected with education. So there is a company which is still in stealth, so I can't actually mention the name of it, but what they've been able to do is think about like the Fortnite model of selling in-game skins,
Dances.
things, exactly, dances, like all of that stuff that's within a game, but the game is very educational, right? And it's a super high value from the educational standpoint. It's super compelling from a game standpoint. And then the way they monetize it is through these kind of in-game purchases. So school districts don't have to pay for it, parents don't have to pay for it directly. And obviously parents are paying for the skins directly, but and it just reduces a friction point of how do I actually get my kid to start learning this? And then once the kid starts learning, like the parents are more than happy to kind of pay $5, $6 for these digital goods. But I think that's one that I've found really fascinating to see how that will play out over time.
I'd love to see more companies iterating on the donation model. So this is inspired by where I went to college, Harvard, which monetizes superficially through the tuition payments, but obviously a lot of it comes from donations from alumni. I think of that business model as like income share on steroids, where instead of just monetizing for this fixed window for the student's life when they first get out of school, you're actually potentially capturing the upside as they grow their income throughout the course of their entire professional careers. So maybe like a pay what you want model could be interesting, or like somehow capitalizing on the fact that the LTV actually increases throughout someone's life.
I love that.
Yeah, taking the super long view, if you think about Stanford and what it does through the Office of Technology Licensing, they don't extract a pound of flesh when you're leaving the university on the assumption that if the company that you're building does well, you'll come back and buy a building for me. Right?
Yeah, I think that and like you can actually think of it as this tithing, right? It's like, that is like, it's a similar business model, and it gives you this massive 100-year perspective on your value proposition.
A lot of the boot camps we've seen are STEM boot camps. They're data science, they're programming. What are the other categories that are amenable to boot camp treatment?
To piggyback off of something I said earlier, I think if you go down the list of all of the professions for which there's a huge worker shortage in the US, that sort of points you in the right direction of what could be really interesting programs to establish that could capture a lot of demand and actually generate a lot of income for you as a business. So I think beyond software engineering, which is the obvious one, there's nursing, there's financial advisors, there's actually a shortage of physical therapists in the US, which I didn't realize. I've heard entrepreneurs referencing wanting to train like sales development reps. Apparently there's a shortage of those. So I think going down the list of like, what are the professions for which there's a huge need in the US, those could all be interesting programs to be established.
I think so I think that's a really interesting lens. I actually think a different lens is like what industries change most quickly, or what are changing most quickly, because those are the ones where you're going to need those kind of continuing education, lifelong learning, And I don't know what exactly that is. Maybe it's like marketing right now. Like maybe marketing.
Data science, for sure.
Maybe it's something like that. But it's those industries where the pace of change is really, really high and
so your skills are always becoming
your skills are constant. And it's actually true of coding, right? It's like that's why I think coding has found this product market fit around the coding bootcamp. It's got both of those. It's got both your skills erode really, really quickly, or like the domain skills erode really, really quickly. Plus there's a huge shortage in the supply and demand of it. So I think that's one reason why that segment of it has really taken off.
Well, if you guys are right about all of this innovation in education, a profession that will change a lot is being a teacher or being a school administrator, right? So maybe we need boot camps for those.
Yeah, I mean, I think one there's a really interesting company based in Detroit which actually thinks of creating these kind of, like they call them gyms, and the teachers are more like trainers, and everybody goes to this physical space and they're kind of more self-directed learning, but there's teachers that are there that can kind of step in, and if you need help with something, they can help you. But it's very self-directed, and then it's, I call them in when I'm having challenges with something, which I think is a really interesting model going forward.
Awesome. Well, my last question to both of you is, what do you believe about education deeply that's not a widely held belief in the real world?
So, all right, well, I will caveat this with, I don't know how deeply I believe this, but I do believe that at least in the United States and Canada, the value of education beyond signaling is overvalued and overstated. I think the value of education as signaling is probably understated. But I think as people think through kind of what bundle they're looking for in education, I think the signaling versus non-signaling value propositions, that right now we are very valuable for one piece, but very unvaluable for everything else.
Well, I think liberal arts education unfairly gets a bad rap in Silicon Valley, which I don't agree with. I think the value of a liberal arts education is great, and I encourage students who can afford to study liberal arts. Aside from that, I think in order to really change educational outcomes in the US, I think a lot needs to change around the social value of becoming a teacher. So I think that's where a lot of the problems stem in the US. When I compare my cousin who is a grade school teacher in China versus the state of teaching K through 12 in the US, I see a vast disparity. In China, it's like an extremely competitive career path. Very few students are accepted to teaching schools. Very few of those graduates get accepted to actual teaching jobs. And so extremely high quality, extremely qualified students go on to become teachers. And so I think in the US, it's very much the opposite. And having the best instruction starts with having the best teachers. So I think that needs to change.
Well, that's a great note to end on, Lee. We definitely need to value our teachers more, salary and otherwise, if we're going to get great outcomes for our kids. So that's a wrap for today's hallway conversation. Thank you, Lee and Darcy, for joining us, and thanks for our YouTube audience. If you liked what you saw, subscribe to our channel, tell your friends, and leave us a comment below to let us know what other hallway conversations you'd like to see. Until next time, bye-bye.